Language awareness. Modals. Before we start, let's do a quick review. When we teach language, in particular grammar, what's the difference between form and function? And can you list some functions? So, to recap, what is the difference between form and function? Well, form is what the language we are teaching looks like, what its components are. If we're teaching the present continuous form, for example, we form it by using the auxiliary verb be in the present simple tense, which we need to conjugate according to the subject. So, I am, he or she is, you, we, they are, plus the present participle, which is usually the verb plus ing. For example, I am flying to Berlin on Tuesday. The function is the purpose of the language, or the speaker's intention or attitude. In this particular case of I am flying to Berlin on Tuesday, the function of the present continuous is a planned future arrangement. It's important to remember that one form has many functions, and one function can have several different forms. We looked at this in verb types, but we'll be revisiting this again in the video later. List some functions. Here are some functions: permission, requests, offers, ability, obligation, predictions, deductions, and giving advice. Going back to the idea of one function, many forms, you can take any of these functions, and there will be various ways or forms to express this function. For example, if we look at obligation, the different forms we can use to express this are you must, you have to, you should, it is mandatory to, etc. So for this input, we are continuing on the verb types task sheet. Look at question 4 and at the verb can in the different sentences here. What different functions does the verb express in each sentence? So they all have the same form, apart from the question and the negative. Subject plus can plus bare infinitive. With the negative, the form is subject plus can plus not, which becomes can't in spoken English, plus the bare infinitive. The interrogative or question form is can plus subject plus bare infinitive. As an aside, when introducing a grammar form to your students, it's a good idea to also include the negatives and interrogatives so they can use the language in more ways than just the positive form. Here, we revisit the idea of one form, many functions. So there are various functions which can be used for the can form. Think first of the most likely context in which they would be said, as this will directly affect the meaning. The first one has been done for you as an example. Can I smoke here? Is something you would say to ask permission, so that is the function of can in this sentence. Can you match the others? Pause the video and do this now. And here are the answers. It can't have been Jerry. He was at home. Is a deduction. I can dance is expressing ability. I can lend you 50 is an offer. And Auckland can be warm in the summer is expressing a characteristic. So as you can see, the modal auxiliary verb can have several different functions. Can is a modal auxiliary verb. There are 9 true auxiliary modal verbs. What are they? and here they are. I find it easy to remember them in these groupings: can, could, shall, should, will, would, may, might, must. We also have semi-modals. Can you name some semi-modal verbs? Here are some examples: have to, ought to, need to, used to, dare to. But what exactly are semi-modal verbs? Semi-modals function in much the same way as modal verbs, in that they are an auxiliary verb that adds information to the main verb, but can't really function alone. They're different from modal verbs, though, because they're usually followed by to, which precedes the main verb. They also behave more like typical verbs. For example, they can change to agree with their subjects, they can change tense, and they can be combined with other helping verbs like be, have, and do. However, in true English language fashion, there are exceptions, and not all of them fit all these categories. Ought to and used to, for example, do not need to agree with the subject, nor do they change tense. Dare is not always followed by the preposition to. So how are modal auxiliaries different from principal auxiliaries? Well, to illustrate, let's look at the sentence. Which of the 9 modal auxiliary verbs can go in this gap? Well, the answer is any of them could, really. It depends on the context and what intention the speaker is trying to convey. If we're talking about permission, it would be can. For about possibility, could. Advice, should. Prediction, will. Obligation, must. So depending on which modal we use, the meaning and function of the language changes. By contrast, if we use a principal auxiliary, do, be, or have, we can use it for emphasis, you do use a dictionary; forming a negative, you don't use a dictionary; or to mark tense, such as the present continuous here, or the present perfect simple here. Note that when using auxiliaries to form tenses, the main verb changes to the present participle or the past participle form, whereas when using modal verbs, the main verb remains in its bare infinitive form. Modal verbs are used in conjunction with main verbs to modify their meaning and mark functions. For example, the speaker's intention, whether it be obligation, certainty, possibility, permission, etc. The main difference is that modals express these functions and signals the speaker's attitude. The principal auxiliary verbs, do, be, and have, do not really mark functions or attitudes, and are used mostly to express tenses, negatives, form questions, short answers and passives, and add emphasis. Now your turn. In question 7 of the task sheet, look at the verbs highlighted in the following dialogue. Decide if they function in this case as an auxiliary verb, a modal or a semi-modal verb, or a main verb. Pause the video and do this now. And here are the answers. Look at the second line with the sentence, "No, I can't." You can see here, this is just the modal verb can. But we've said before that they can't function alone. Therefore, which main verb is it being used in conjunction with? So the sentence, "No, I can't," is being used in conjunction with the verb come in response to the question, "Are you coming to the opera?" So the main verb can be implicit. Modals cannot function and have no real meaning on their own, unless used as a short answer if the main verb has already been referred to earlier, as it has been used here. Modal verbs. What features of form would you highlight to students? So in teaching modal verbs, it's important to raise our learners' awareness of how to actually form it grammatically. Think of what comes after the modal verb. What about negatives and questions? How is the form different from that of main verbs? When highlighting the form of modal verbs, you would teach or elicit that modal verbs are followed by the bare infinitive of the main verb. For example, I can swim. To form the negative, we would add not after the modal and before the main verb. I cannot swim, or contracted in spoken English to I can't swim. To form a question, we would invert the subject and the modal. So the modal comes first in a question. Can you swim? And how are they different from main verbs? Well, there's no need for subject-verb agreement. They don't change their form, so there's no ing or ed endings. And modals can't be used together. Please refer to the worksheet, Modal Verbs Explained, for more ways in which modals are different from principal auxiliaries and main verbs. This is separate from the task sheet and can be found in the same shared folder. Now, on page 3 of the task sheet, where it says Modals and Functions, have a look at the groups of sentences in the table. Above the table are the functions of the language being exemplified by the sentences. Decide which function belongs to which group of sentences. Remember, the function depends on the context, so it may be useful to consider the context first for each sentence group, so you can justify your answer. To illustrate this, for the group of sentences in Part B, look at the sentence, "You can't park here." This could be either an obligation, or rather a prohibition, as in, this is a car reserved for disabled people. You can't park here. Or it could be possibility. You can't park here because the space is too small. However, if you look at the other sentences, the context is clearly about obligation rather than ability. As well as context, the function will also depend on the speaker's attitude or intention. Now, on your own, or with your partner or group, fill in the table on page 3 of the task sheet using the functions above the table. And here are the answers. A. Permission. B. As we discussed before, obligation. C. Advice. D. Deduction. E. Possibility. F. Ability. G. Prediction. H. Offers or suggestions. I. Requests. And J. Threats or promises. And again, because it's important to keep emphasizing this, one form has many functions, and one function has many forms. And what do we mean by this? One form can express several different functions. So let's take the first conditional form. If something happens, something will happen. If you do that again, I'll be angry is a warning. If you take that shortcut, you'll get there on time is advice. If you go shopping tomorrow, I'll go with you is a plan. And if you pass the test, I'll buy you some biscuits is a promise. One function can be expressed in several different forms. So the function of giving advice can be expressed using you should, as in you should exercise more. If I were you, I would exercise more. And why don't you exercise more? Think about question 11. In a lesson, would you focus on one form and clarify all the various functions, or would you focus on one function and highlight different forms to express it? Consider this now, or discuss it with your partner or group. Resume the video when done. So, it's best to focus on one function. For example, a lesson on polite requests, and teach a few different forms for expressing this. This is because it's much easier to present the lesson using one context. Teaching one form, for example, the modal auxiliary verb can, with several different functions, permission, ability, possibility, deduction, would get very confusing for our learners. So, to summarize, modal auxiliary verbs are used in conjunction with main verbs to modify their meaning and mark functions. For example, the speaker's intention. You should also be able to name all 9 of the modals. In addition to expressing functions and signaling the speaker's attitude, modals are different from main and auxiliary verbs because they do not change form. There's no ing or past tense forms, for example. Nor do they adhere to subject-verb agreement. You've also learnt about some semimodals, their similarities and differences to true modals, and can name some examples. You've reviewed form and function and seen that it is better to teach one function in a lesson with several different forms, rather than one form and several functions, which could get very confusing for your learners. In the next section, work with your group or partner to ask and answer any questions that you may still have after watching the video. Organize your notes and highlight the key information about what you've covered on modals and semimodals, form and function, and the reasons why we use modal verbs. Prepare your questions and any comments that you want to raise with your group or tutors on the next OT. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next OT.